Thank you very much for that introduction. So I will introduce the members of our panel today. We are very fortunate to have here today Cecily Hardaway, Assistant Professor of African American Studies here at the University of Maryland in College Park. Dr. Cecily Hardaway holds a doctorate in development psychology with a formal concentration in quantitative psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her program of research melds family studies with developmental and community psychology and applies a sociological lens toward understanding how race and socioeconomic status intersect and shape child development and family processes. Through her research, she seeks to uncover pathways to positive adaptation and upward socioeconomic mobility for African American children and families from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. I'm also pleased to introduce Dr. Dawn Dow, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland, here in College Park as well. She is a faculty associate at the Maryland Population Research Center here at the university and received a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. She also earned a JD from Columbia University School of Law. Dr. Dow is the incoming director of the Critical Race Initiative. Her research examines the intersections of race, class, and gender within the context of the family, educational settings, the workplace, the law, and political mobilization. Her book, Mothering While Black, The Boundaries and Burdens of Middle-Class Parenthood with the University of California Press, examines African-American middle and upper middle-class mothers' approaches to parenting their children and their views and decision-making about work, family, and childcare. Finally, I'm also very pleased to introduce Dr. Rebecca Jordan-Young, an associate professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College. She is a socio-medical scientist specializing in study design and synthesis. She is affiliated with women's gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College in Columbia University and explores reciprocal relations between science and social hierarchies, including gender, sexuality, class, and race. Her first book, Brainstorm, The Flaws in the Science of Sex Differences, published by Harvard University Press in 2010, won a Distinguished Book Award from the Association for Women in Psychology. And her latest book, Testosterone, an Unauthorized Biography, was co-written with Katrina Karkassis and will be published by Harvard University Press in October 2019. Thank you very much, and join me in welcoming this wonderful panel.
Well, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to present today. My name is Cecily Hardaway, and I am an assistant professor in African American Studies. And today I'm going to be talking to you about low-income African American women and the challenges of balancing work and family. You'll see that there's another author on this presentation. Her name is Megan Pita. She's actually an undergraduate here at the University of Maryland who's excellent and who has actually been a big help with this project. So I wanted to acknowledge her in this presentation. So I'll start off by just giving some background about African American women in work. So African American women with minor children are more likely to be employed than women in other racial and ethnic groups. In 2016, about 65% of African American women with children under age 6 were employed. And that's compared to about 61.5% of women in all other groups. African American women have the shortest postpartum breaks in employment. So after they give birth to children, they have sort of the shortest turnaround between the time that they give birth and go back to work. African American women are also more likely to engage in sustained full-time employment during the 18 years following their first child's birth. Also, when you think about African American women in work, you have to think about working conditions. So African American women are working in less favorable conditions than other women. So for example, things like non-standard work schedules, jobs that lack benefits, and other experiences like discrimination and bias in the workplace. And poor working conditions really increase the difficulties around meeting children's health needs and children's developmental needs while maintaining employment. Also, just a few other background facts. African American women earn less than women in most other groups. So you'll see an overrepresentation in terms of service sector occupations. Some of this is due to lower levels of education and things like labor market discrimination. And overall, African American women are more likely than women in other groups to be among the working poor. So among those who work at least 27 weeks in a year, but their income still falls below the poverty line. Also, I guess a big thing to think about, especially in the context of the study that I'm going to talk to you about today, is low-wage employment. A lot of particularly low-income African-American women are working in low-wage employment. And some of the characteristics of low-wage employment include poverty-level wages, things like limited workers' rights, and little to no opportunity for advancement. And welfare reform was particularly impactful for those who are working poor and those who would be among the working poor. I'm referring to welfare reform because the study that I'll be talking about today was conducted right around the time of welfare reform. And it had large impacts on, as I said, those who are working poor and those who would be among the working poor. So welfare reform was enacted in the 1990s, and it converted AFDC to TANF, so aid to families with dependent children, into temporary assistance for needy families. And TANF really centered around time limits for welfare receipt, as well as strict work requirements. And because of welfare reform, a lot of women on welfare were pushed off of the rolls and into low-wage employment. And as I mentioned, welfare reform has strict work requirements, time limits, but another element was sanctions. So these financial penalties that people would incur for not complying with work requirements. So basically they take your cash assistance away if you don't comply with certain requirements. Also, other aspects of welfare reform, they separated food assistance or food stamps from cash assistance. So someone could receive food stamps without being on welfare or without receiving cash assistance, whereas before they were kind of tied together. There's also requirements for job training. They built in into the policy where if you have an additional child while you're on welfare, you can't receive additional cash benefits. And this is in particular to welfare reform, but one of the issues with welfare more broadly is that there's no real launching pad off of welfare, and some of what I'll talk about will get into that. So my broad research question was, how do low-income African-American women navigate work and family? So this is my general kind of broad question, and you'll see that it kind of expanded to include women navigating education as well as navigating the welfare system. So the data I'm using for this project is from Welfare, Children and Families, a 3-city study. This was an ethnographic study conducted from 1999 to 2003. There were 256 African-American, Mexican-American, Puerto Rican, and non-Hispanic white families. At recruitment, each of those families had a target child between the ages of 2 and 4. They were recruited from Chicago, Boston, and San Antonio. Some of the families were on TANF, some were non-TANF. And the ethnographers met with each family once or twice per month for 12 to 18 months. And follow-up interviews were conducted every 6 months thereafter through 2003. And for my particular research that I'll talk about today, I'm specifically focusing on 26 African-American women living in Chicago. My intention is to focus on the full sample of African-American women, which is about 98 families. But this particular group of 26 ranged in age from 21 to 43. They had a mean number of about a little over 3 children. For data analysis, there were copious field notes, interview transcripts, family profiles. And family profiles were kind of like a rough summary of what was going on in each family that included information from the field notes. And what we did was I had a group of students that I was working with who created case studies for each family, looking at the field notes, interview transcripts. We wrote memos for the families in Chicago. We're in the process of developing a coding scheme, moving on to actually coding, and then undergoing kind of systematic coding and identifying themes and patterns. So we're kind of like in a preliminary stage right now. So everything that I'll present to you is really cursory and kind of preliminary. So the first thing that I'll talk about is sort of the nature of work that the women in the study were engaged in. Most, I would say, had a series of low-wage, part-time jobs, and these jobs were interspersed with periods of unemployment. There were very few who had stable jobs or full-time employment. I can think of maybe 1 or 2 of the 26 who had stable jobs or full-time employment. And when it comes to the working conditions, a lot of what we were able to see really mimics was out in the larger literature. So women were working for low wages. They didn't have any type of paid leave, so no vacation leave, no medical leave, parental leave. And I'll talk about sort of the impact of not having paid leave in a bit. Oftentimes the women had very long or complicated commutes. So commutes that were 1.5 to 2 hours one way, having to take 2 and 3 buses to get to a job. Many of them also worked non-standard hours, so graveyard shift and third shift, or had these unpredictable work schedules where on a weekly basis they would kind of find out their schedule or be called in to work at different times. Also, there's an issue of workplace safety, but not necessarily in the way that I think people think about workplace safety traditionally. So for our families, their actual work environments may be in a dangerous neighborhood. So for example, we have families who are working for the Chicago Housing Authority, and there's always, I won't say always, but sometimes shootings around where they work. One of the women in our study had a bullet come through her office while she was at work. So I'll move on to some of the reasons that women are entering and exiting the workplace. So some of this is around firing. We have some women who are fired when they get pregnant. The issue of not having leave comes up because sometimes women will have pregnancy complications that require them to take time off, but they don't get paid for having time off. And if they take time off, they can be fired for their jobs. Women enter and exit around childbirth. And some of entering and exiting has to do with a lack of child care. That's a really big issue. Things like transportation, again. When women have to take those very long, complicated commutes, that usually doesn't last long, and it's usually unsustainable. Sorry. Other things that affect entering and exiting the workplace are things like negative life events. If you look at the literature on negative life events, people who are low income experience more negative life events. All these variety of things that can go wrong in your life that impact your ability to work. And that's related to sort of this stress proliferation where one thing will go wrong or one negative event will happen and it'll kind of lead to this snowball of negative life events. Other things that come up for our families are homelessness. So not having a stable place to live and how that impacts their ability to work and maintain a job. As in the traditional work and family literature, you see issues with work-family conflict within our families as well. So this, I'm defining it here as when work interferes with family or vice versa. So some of the family-related stressors that we see are sick children, and then that goes back to not having paid leave, lack of social support. The women who seem to do the best actually have supportive family members, people that they can rely on for housing and things like that. Also, an issue that kind of surprised me that comes up is this imposition of traditional gender norms and how that creates conflicts in households. So some of the women in the study have partners who kind of insist on these traditional gender roles, but they really don't have a traditional situation where you know, the male is the breadwinner, but they kind of want to impose that on the household, despite the fact that the woman might be the actual breadwinner, might be working 2 jobs, et cetera. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is we started off looking at formal work, but discovered that women have all types of what we're calling side hustles. So informal forms of employment that brings in extra income. And sometimes it's a matter of having difficulty balancing formal work, education, as well as side hustles. So some women have to choose between all those things. And some of the most common side hustles, I would say, are things like hairstyling, babysitting, but there's also some side hustles that I would say are less common, but people also sell drugs, prostitution, sell food stamps, and things like that. Some of the reasons for side hustles are wanting a better life. We have some women who are really, I would characterize them as entrepreneurs who want to start businesses. So they're selling lotions and soaps and gift baskets. And there's also women who do it more on an as-needed basis, where they are trying to get extra money for things like their children's activities that come up, and field trips, things like that. And it's a way of earning extra money without encountering sanctions or having your benefits cut. So this is an ethnographer speaking about a woman named Dahlia, who's age 30. She said, Dahlia said, "I make a lot of money braiding hair and I don't want to admit to it." She said that she did not want to talk about it, and I assured her that it was her right not to talk about something if she did not want to. She asked me to cross it off of the chart, which I did. So they were filling out a chart about her income sources and work, and she asked the ethnographer to cross that part out, but she was saying that she does make money from hair braiding. Just quickly moving on to education, many participants do not have high school diplomas or GEDs, but the majority are participating in educational certificate programs pertaining to nursing or healthcare. They kind of frequently switch between different fields because some of these programs are really short term. But when it comes to education, TANF really restricts how much education and training counts towards the work requirements. So families are, in a sense, trying to be upwardly mobile through education, but there are restrictions imposed by TANF on how much time they can actually spend on education and how much time they have to spend at work. So something like higher education is particularly difficult. So like work, participants are frequently entering and exiting educational programs for a variety of reasons. Their trajectories are really non-linear, and they're struggling to balance work, family, and education. And oftentimes they have to choose among those things. And safety can sometimes play a role in continuing education. So here's one example of Nadine, age 25. She says, "I always was a full-time student. Even when I was working, it was stressful. That's why I left, because I mean, trying to work in school and the kids, I was like all day, every day. I couldn't stand it, 7 days a week. I was like that from the time I started working in 2000 when I came back in January. It was, oh my God. I just got tired of it. I was fortunate to have gotten approved for Section 8 last year, and since I knew I didn't have to worry about the rent, that gave me all the more reason to stop working. And I'm like, I only have a year left and a year and a half left of school, so why not?" So this was an example of a person who at a particular time was choosing to focus on their education. One of the things that I'll just wrap up by saying, because I know that I am out of time, is that welfare itself can actually be a very disruptive force in people's lives. On the one hand, they, when it's available, they get access to different benefits. But we have many women in our study whose benefits are, who are sanctioned at different points, whose benefits are cut off for various reasons. So it's almost like a part-time job to manage welfare benefits. And a lot of it has to do with the actual disorganization on the part of the welfare office. People will get letters for an appointment on Friday and their appointment was on the previous Monday. So things like that, and it's not just one case. Letters and paperwork will get lost, and these sanctions actually result in, or they can result in people being without cash assistance, food stamps, or different other benefits for months at a time. So it can be very disruptive and kind of unstable, unpredictable things in people's lives. I just want to close by just acknowledging a few people. The data that I presented to you today, the PI of the study is an ethnographer and sociologist her name is Linda Burton. I actually worked on this project when I was an undergraduate student, and she allowed me to come back 20 years later and do this data analysis. I also want to thank the students who worked on the project, the participating families, as well as a research and scholarship award from the graduate school that allowed me to do some of this work over the summer. Thank you.
I'm new to glasses, so I don't know if I need them yet, so that's why I have them nearby. Apologies. Hi, my name is Dawn Dow. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, and I want to thank the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, for Dr. Mahmoudi for inviting me, and Dr. Seaman for organizing this event together. It's been a wonderful 2 days of empowerment and thought-provoking presentations, so I look forward to a sort of robust Q&A after this presentation. So today I'll be presenting a portion of a chapter of my recent book, Mothering While Black: Boundaries and Burdens of Middle-Class Motherhood. I became interested in this topic because of what I saw as a regular omission of Black or African-American mothers from both academic research and public discourse on middle-class mothers. Let me go to the next slide, actually, to show you this picture. So often those discussions primarily or exclusively focused on the experiences of white middle-class women, at times noting that Black women seem to feel or think differently about work-family issues, and at times do different things, but often noted as an aside and not the crux of the investigation. So despite the important contributions of this commentary and the research, it failed to adequately capture the experiences of African-American middle and upper middle class mothers. This research has often focused on commonalities resulting from similarities across class rather than exploring how race and gender complicate mothering experiences. My research sort of began with a curiosity about how African-American middle-class mothers approach parenting, family, and work, and how race, class, and gender influence those approaches. I focused on mothers because they are often primarily responsible for socializing young children, and previous research has found that African-American mothers are also more likely to engage in the racial socialization of younger children. I also wanted to center the experiences of African-American mothers, and I focused on middle and upper middle class mothers because this group typically has more resources to address discrimination than do lower income African-American mothers, so we might have a clearer picture of how gender and race impact parenting practices with resources to actually have choice in those situations. So the book I'll almost give you a little preview of the book as a teaser in case any of you are interested in reading the whole thing. It's divided into two main parts. The first part examines the parenting practices and perspectives of Black middle-class mothers. It engages with dominant frameworks that examine how economic resources impact middle-class parenting practices. And this is a framework where they think class and things related to it, like education and occupation, are more important factors in influencing how parents approach raising their children, and other factors like racial identity are viewed as less important. This approach, often referred to as conservative cultivation, emphasizes encouraging children's logical reasoning, developing children's intellectual and physical skills through organized enrichment activities, and viewing educational and other institutions in society from an entitlements and service-oriented perspective. I'm happy to talk about part 2 in the Q&A, but I'm not talking about it today. It examines African-American middle-class mothers' approaches to family and work and childcare, and engages frameworks that see society as separate spheres that are divided along gender lines, and the public sphere of men in the workplace, and a private sphere of women in the home. Now, modern versions of this idea in sociology include the framework of competing devotions, which views working outside of the home as conflicting with being a mother, and intensive mothering, which views child rearing as an exclusive or primary duty of mothers, and mothering as an all-consuming, time-intensive activity that occurs within a nuclear family context. My research suggests that all mothers are not equally shaped by these frameworks or ideologies of motherhood. So today's presentation, I'm going to focus on two questions. How does gender impact the challenges African-American middle-class mothers believe their children will confront? And what strategies do they use to help their sons and daughters navigate these challenges? So when we examine parenting, some scholars suggest that class is key in determining how parents raise their children. Indeed, often when scholars are talking about African-American mothers, often they're just talking about whether or not it's a race or class perspective that influences parenting. It's an either-or proposition. So I explore how intersections of race, class, and gender complicate the experiences of members of the expanding African-American middle class, particularly as it relates to family work and parenting. These intersections, combined with what I call societal reception in this model, influence the concerns parents have and the strategies they use to address those concerns. Research on families has often focused on characteristics that are internal to them, such as income, cultural traditions, family structure, and education. But I suggest that part of unpacking how and why African-American middle-class mothers approach raising their children in the ways that they do requires that we examine how these mothers and their children are differently received, or at least how they perceive themselves to be received in the broader white and mainstream society. And I've called this societal reception. Now, critical whiteness scholars such as Wise and McIntosh tell us part of the dominant experience of being white and a middle-class family is not regularly or explicitly thinking about racial identity and how it informs parental concerns or decision-making. African-American middle-class families do not generally share that luxury. Indeed, there is an abundance of evidence that middle-class African-Americans continue to face discrimination in housing, educational settings, employment, healthcare, and interactions with law enforcement. These forms of discrimination prevent middle-class African-Americans from fully reaping the benefits of their middle-class resources. So just to provide some background about methods, this is a little quick slide. The book is based on 60 in-depth, semi-structured interviews of African-American middle and upper-class mothers living in the San Francisco Bay Area who were recruited to the study using a modified snowball sample. I reached out to a number of organizations, parenting organizations, religious organizations to recruit them. The interviews were conducted between 2009 and 2011. All participants were raising at least one child that was age 10 or younger, and middle-class status was determined by a combination of education and total family income. Participants had attended college for at least 2 years, and their total family income ranged from $50,000 to $300,000. Now, the upper end of this income probably sounds high to a lot of you guys. However, in the San Francisco Bay Area between 2006 and 2010, the median owner-occupied home value was $637,000. Home ownership is an important marker of middle-class status. Participants in the upper end of this income range were often among the few who could easily attain that marker. I should also say that I was making this decision around the time that Obama was trying to decide what was going to be the cutoff for the middle class, the increased tax rate for quote-unquote middle-class families, and he was debating between $250,000 and $300,000 at the time. So I took the higher amount, and so there might be a couple people in the samples who might be better described as upper class as opposed to upper middle class. The majority of participants, 3/4, were married. Participants' ages ranged from 25 to 49, and the majority, 63%, earned advanced degrees, such as an MD, JD, PhD, or MA, with 27% earning a college degree and 10% attending some college. Half were homeowners and half were renters. So this is an educated and relatively privileged group of women who are discussing their parenting their strategies. So the African American mothers in this research had concerns that they shared for sons and daughters, but in this presentation, I'll be focusing on those concerns that differed based on intersections of race and gender. I also want to highlight that the gendered and racialized context in which this research was conducted differed by gender and seemed to inform and animate these mothers' concerns and parenting practices. So in terms of sons, this research was bookended by 2 shooting deaths of unarmed African American males. The first, Oscar Grant, and the second, Trayvon Martin. As you may recall, on New Year's Day 2010, Johannes Morzeli, a white Bay Area rapid transit police officer in Oakland, fatally shot Oscar Grant, a young African American man, in the back. During the incident, Mr. Grant was unarmed, laying face down on the train platform, and had been subdued by several other officers. On July 8, 2010, Morzeli was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, not the higher charge of second-degree murder or voluntary manslaughter. On February 12, 2012, Trayvon Martin was pursued, shot, and killed by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch coordinator, while walking home from a convenience store in his father's safe, gated middle-class community. Despite being a child from that middle-class community, it was not safe for Martin. Zimmerman was initially released from custody without being charged on Florida's Stand Your Ground laws. It took a national movement, weeks of pressure from the public and media, and a special investigator finally to file charges against him. On July 13th, Zimmerman was found not guilty of second-degree murder or the lesser charge of manslaughter. So I tell you this because these were some of the, particularly Oscar Grant stories, sometimes raised during interviews when people were talking about the concerns they had for their children. Now there have been numerous additional shooting deaths of unarmed African American boys and men by police and members of the public, and increasingly African American parents are sharing their concerns for their son's safety. And I show these images of unarmed African American boys and men who were killed over the last few years to underscore that this is the societal context that animates African American middle-class mothers' concerns and parenting practices regarding their sons. The social context for daughters during the time I was doing this research was somewhat different. So although mothers believed their daughters were barraged with messages that they were unworthy, unattractive because they did not have the right skin color, facial features, or hair textures, many of the same mothers also mentioned examples of relatively more positive depictions of African American women that were available to their daughters. As this research began, Michelle Obama became the first African American First Lady, and the Disney's Princess Frog, featuring the first African American princess, was released. Some mothers in my sample described organizing viewings of this movie with other African American mothers and their children. Over the time these interviews were conducted, there was a music video, I Love My Hair, that was produced by Sesame Street and went viral among both children and women. In this video, an African American girl was encouraged to love her hair in all of its natural forms. Malia Obama sported cornrows and twists, which decreased the stigma of those hairstyles and encouraged some mothers in my research to be more willing to have their daughters wear them. And so we might think that these ideas about hair and beauty are superficial, but African American women's beauty and hair has confronted a surprising amount of scrutiny. Military schools and company policies have outlawed certain natural hairstyles for women. African American women's appearance has been discussed and debated, and there have been attempts to regulate it by various societal institutions. As these mothers' accounts reveal, they felt their daughters were bombarded by messages from the mainstream media that Black women were not beautiful or valued. These different social contexts influenced mothers' concerns. I interviewed Karen, a married mother, while she nursed her child in her apartment. Karen let out a deep sigh before describing how she felt when she learned her baby's gender. She said, "I was thrilled the baby wasn't a boy. I think it is hard to be a Black girl and a Black woman in America, but I think it's dangerous and sometimes deadly to be a Black boy and a Black man. Oscar Grant and beyond, there are lots of dangerous interactions with police in urban areas for Black men. So I was very nervous because we thought she was a boy. I was relieved when she wasn't. It's terrible, but it's true. Now, Karen's relief upon learning her child was not a boy underscores how intersections of racial identity, class, and gender influence parenting concerns and practices. Her comments also speak to the different quality of concerns mothers had for sons versus those that they had for daughters, and underscores how processes that are occurring at the macro level have an impact at the micro level. The concerns that mothers had for their daughters were also shaped by race and gender, but they were different, and for many seemed more manageable. For example, another mother who had previously described in our interview her concerns for her son's safety, her name was Carlin, and I asked her about her concerns for her daughter, and she said, not as many. I think, not as many. I don't know, it just feels as though it's a little easier for her to do what she needs to do and be who she needs to be because she is perceived as less of a threat than he will be. Carlin's concerns for her daughter focused on ensuring she had a strong self-esteem, was educated, and could take care of herself. The challenges daughters would face often seemed less onerous because, unlike their sons, these mothers did not worry about sending their daughters into a world where they would be perceived as a physical threat that needed to be contained. Mothers were primarily concerned with their sons' safety and preventing them from being criminalized as thugs, and were primarily concerned with protecting and strengthening their daughters' self-esteem and self-value. Mothers I interviewed were keenly aware of the assumptions about propensities towards violence and illegal behavior that were attached to their African-American sons. And despite being middle and upper middle class, they also felt limited in their ability to protect their sons from this reality. Mary, a married mother of a son and daughter, described a conversation that regularly occurred in her mother's group, revealing her worries about adequately preparing her son. She said, with our sons, we talk about how we can prepare them or teach them about how to deal with a society, especially in a community like Oakland, where Black men are held to a different standard than others, and not necessarily a better one. So there are some assumptions and beliefs that are placed on them just by physically looking at them that can hold them back. When you're a Black man and you get stopped by the policeman, you can't do the same things a white person would do because they might already have some preconceived notions, and that might get you into a heap more trouble. We talk about our sons who are a little younger and starting kindergarten. What do we have to do to make sure teachers don't have preconceived ideas that stop our sons from learning because they believe little brown boys are more rambunctious, or little brown boys are hitting more than Caucasian boys? So middle-class mothers are typically depicted as viewing educators and law enforcement as resources. But these mothers viewed these groups as threats and sources of gendered racism for their sons and daughters. Sending their children out into the world and to school was a source of stress. They viewed police as potential predators and teachers as potential tyrants. Nia, a married mother of 2 sons, described interactions with other families at local children's activities that she called baby racism, and underscored how concerns about criminalization emerged early in her children's lives. From the time our son was a baby and we would go to different children's activities, our son would go and hug a kid, and a parent would grab him and be like, oh, he's going to attack him. And it was just like, really, are you serious? He was actually going to give him a hug. You see, like baby racism. I've even written to local parenting listservs to ask, am I imagining this? And the response was interesting. Almost all of the Black mothers wrote in, you're not imagining this, this is real, you're going to have to spend the rest of your life fighting for your child. Nia, like other participants, believed that when African-American boys participated in activities, their behavior faced greater scrutiny and stigma. Participants also worried about the toll of these images on their sons and the type of self-perception that they might cultivate as they transition to manhood based upon societal expectations of them. So it's important to reiterate that these are middle and upper middle class mothers and families. These are the sorts of households that on paper would seem to exemplify middle class resources and privileges, and one would assume would have access to good schools, dedicated teachers, and safe neighborhoods. But these participants saw teachers and educators and law enforcement as potential threats to their sons' development and safety. Now, when Mary mentioned above, described the concern she had about her daughter, her focus shifted. One of the things she's talked about was, one of the things we talk about in the group is what are some of the challenges we faced, that we believe our children are going to face and how we can prepare them. Whether it's I'm the only black girl in the school, or someone is wondering why my hair is curly, or is telling me I look like a monkey because it doesn't straighten like theirs. How can we prepare them? How can we instill in them a sense of beauty and sense of pride in who they are? Mary's comments illustrate concerns for her daughter and her desire to have her learn her own value and worth as an African American mother. This was something Mary later stated she did not believe was reflected in the messages her daughter received from the broader society. So I want to talk about some of the strategies that mothers use to counter some of these challenges. So in terms of dealing with people's social interactions, mothers try to approach dealing with these issues using something I called experience management, which focused on trying to seek out opportunities for their children to have exposure to healthy versions of black masculinity where their sons could learn how to navigate being black men. They also used a version of what I call environment management, where they tried to make sure that their communities were free of racism, and that their kids were able to be in a setting where they had sort of scrutinized to make sure they weren't having interactions with folks who were going to judge them based on their race. For their daughters, they often focused on trying to cultivate a peer group that would support them and that looked like them and that would reaffirm their value and their beauty. So this is the sort of social interaction management that mothers did with their children. In terms of their sons, I'm going to skip ahead because I'd love to give you more examples, but I'm running out of time, I know. In terms of demeanor, mothers talked about trying to manage their sons' emotions, right? So they knew that their sons could not interact with people in the world in the same way as their white male counterparts, and focused on putting them in yoga classes so that they would be able to control how they experienced things during the day and have a calm demeanor. And again, image management, told their sons that they shouldn't wear a hoodie because even though they thought this was unfair and that they shouldn't have to manage themselves in this way, felt that it was something that might diminish the likelihood that they would be stopped by the police or harassed at school in some way. Now, I should say that mothers also talked about image management with their daughters, but the consequences were different. They were concerned that their daughters might be viewed as quote unquote ghetto or they had unruly parents. They weren't as concerned about their daughters being killed because they were wearing an outfit. The last two things I want to talk about are more focused on daughters and their experiences. Let's skip ahead, sorry. I'm going the wrong direction. Sorry, I'm gonna get there. It was media management and toy management. So media management, these are kind of related concepts, but for example, you can see here, mothers were really interested in trying to expose their young children to positive images in books and in cartoons and in media, the Princess Frog, of black women and brown women. One mother talked about encouraging her daughter to watch Dora because Dora was at least brown and was running around and trying to see the world. And people also talked about this in terms of buying toys for their children as well, their daughters in particular, so making sure that their daughter had exposure to black and brown Barbie dolls or black and brown baby dolls, right? And one mother had a very poignant story about her daughter going to a child care and finding the lone doll and picking it up and scooping it up and extolling it to all of her white classmates in terms of how beautiful it was. And then that daycare having to go off and buy more black baby dolls because the children started to have disputes about that doll, right? So a very positive change that she wasn't certain would have happened had she not supported her. But I'm gonna sum up with my last slide here, which is my discussion and conclusion slide. So these mothers were basically encouraging their children at time to engage in strategic sacrifices and expression, right, of their race and their identity because of concerns that they had about how they would be navigating the world. They felt as though they had to be constrained in their expressions of race and often had to understand how society viewed them in a negative way, but also simultaneously cultivate a more positive image of themselves for themselves, a version of what W.E.B. Du Bois would call double consciousness. Ironically, a lot of the mothers in doing this and knowing that their children had to act differently were kind of compelled to reproduce a sense of inequality in society because telling your child that you have to act differently and they act differently and then because they receive differently is reaffirming that process. Having said that, these mothers were trying to protect the spirit of their children, the bodies of their sons, and the self-esteem of their daughters. Thank you. I'm sorry I went over.
That's right. I'm so happy to be on this panel. Thank you so much for inviting me to the conference. Hoda for the invitation, Kate also for the great organizing work that you did, and everybody for being here. But it's especially nice to be on this panel and follow, because I think so much of the context for what I'm going to talk about has been made really clear already. So let me get my... Well, that's not that one. Hold on. Which one? Where is it? Here it is. I found it. Yeah. Got it. First interview we'll go from the start, or it doesn't actually matter. Okay. In a military courtroom at Fort Benning, Georgia, on March 15th, 1971, prosecutors made their closing arguments against Lieutenant William Calley for the most notorious massacre of the Vietnam War. 3 years earlier, dozens of U.S. soldiers had murdered, raped, and/or mutilated scores of unarmed civilians of all ages in the Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai. Though more than 100 men participated in the atrocities, Calley was the only person ever convicted. The brutality and scale of the violence at My Lai were beyond belief to most Americans at the time, but an explanation of sorts could be found on the front page of the Washington Post as the events unfolded. Nestled alongside an article reporting Calley's trial was a second article proclaiming Army psychiatrists are studying the relationship between male sex hormones and aggression to find a way to keep irrational killers out of the military. Now, no one was directly saying that this particular war crime could be chalked up to a ferocious case of testosterone poisoning, but the juxtaposition of the articles, and in fact, as you see, it's tucked in between. This article about testosterone and aggression is tucked in between two different reports about the My Lai atrocities. And the specific quotes from the research psychiatrists about their studies definitely alluded to a connection between testosterone and the massacre. One of them said, "We're trying to weed out people who can't handle their aggressions, people who are so aggressive that they haven't learned how to control it." This was Dr. Robert Rose, one of the psychiatrists whose work was featured in the report. My talk today is based on my new book, Testosterone, an Unauthorized Biography, co-written with Katrina Karkazis and coming out next month, October 15th, in fact. In this unauthorized biography of testosterone, we start with the observation that testosterone is a fascinating character with a double life. One as a molecule, a steroid hormone with a precise chemical structure, and the other as an outsized cultural figure who gets blamed and praised for a huge array of phenomena that are considered to be the virtues and vices of men. Typically, people think of scientific approaches to T, and I'm going to use testosterone's nickname T through most of the talk. So the scientific work is supposedly the place for precision. It should be that. And we might think that any resonance between scientific claims and cultural stories comes about because the cultural stories are to some extent grounded in a material reality of what this hormone does. But our work, and the work of many other feminist science and technology studies scholars and feminist scientists, has shown, we're working in a long tradition, shows a much messier relationship between these realms, which isn't in itself surprising, but it's important to do this because the authorized biography of testosterone, the idea is that it's the male sex hormone, for example, that it drives aggression and violence. that it makes people bold risk takers. It determines both who is out of control and also who's on top in social hierarchies, that it drives both sexual longing and sexual violence and more. That authorized familiar version of T is so powerful that Katrina and I decided it was worth taking a close look at the scientific evidence and the cultural stories, how they're woven together in these particular domains that I mentioned, to see how that science connects to the cultural stories and what kinds of social effects the specific concrete claims about T have right now. Now, even people who are skeptical about attributing social problems to biology in most realms, people who, for example, might be skeptical of the idea that women occupy an inferior social and political position to men because of some eternal facts about our brains, as Daphne Joel said this morning, it completely took apart that idea, or because of hormones out of control. Too often, these same people, that is us, may casually refer to, quote, too much testosterone as the reason for bad behavior. This is a great example recently in discussing in the magazine The Cut, the online venue, the very interesting progressive thinkers very casually, maybe it was tongue-in-cheek, when asking about when Rebecca Traister says, honest to God, what is wrong with people? And Ross responds, mostly testosterone, apparently. Maybe it's a joke, maybe it's tongue-in-cheek, but it's part of what keeps the narrative going. It reiterates this idea. And it's a strong thrum of this notion that we just can't get around it. This is just the way we are. This is just how things are going to be. So one of the most enduring stories, of course, about testosterone is this notion that it drives violent aggression. The association obviously didn't start with the My Lai massacre, but I began with the Washington Post's pairing of Callie's trial and Robert Rose's research because it's a great example of how the scientific enterprise is part and parcel of the larger social and political world. And because it really beautifully illustrates how scientific facts, once they get established, are very, very difficult to dislodge. Once it is the case that something has been established, that just keeps rolling forward, even often with the same old citation, gaining more and more and more hundreds of citations. This study, not to mention the wildly misleading association of the study with the massacre, would be unlikely to make it into print today. Yet the study's central finding was this, that high levels of testosterone are related to, quote, more serious offending or, quote, more violent crimes among criminals. That claim has shed its embarrassing origins in a very badly flawed study, and it lives on as a simple empirical truth. It's no longer weighed down by the specifics of a study that doesn't match the methods and theories of contemporary endocrinology or behavioral research. It's out there already. It's really hard to get that genie back in the bottle. So the foundational studies on T and human aggression date to a roughly 30-year period from the 1970s through the 1990s. These studies are where you'll find grand claims that higher T levels have been found in violent criminals and others whose behavior is, quote, antisocial and specifically aggressive. Later studies, especially lab research, measuring subtle aggressive actions like punishing another player in a computer game, the kinds of things that are published right now, are layered upon these foundations, and they're citing them. Those old studies are embedded in the newer stuff in a way that seems to extend the connection between testosterone and outright violence to very minor hostilities and the notion that a whole array of bad behaviors can be traced to the effects of this hormone. Now, contemporary scientists tend to shy away from bold claims that T causes aggression, at least on its own. They also increasingly acknowledge that T responds to behavior in social situations. In other words, when we face particular kinds of social challenges or changes in status, and in particular stress has been studied a lot, or participate in certain kinds of physical activities, like intense exercise, especially weight-bearing exercise, or complex emotional and physical interactions like sexual behavior. our bodies very often respond by either increasing or decreasing our production of T. And these are very dramatic responses. Some of the scientists we talked to when we were doing the book described very short intervention studies that they did with athletes where they were trying to do what you might think of as a legal, a non-doping way to get testosterone up in athletes, because at that time they thought that was going to help the athletes. That's another whole story. It didn't actually help them. But they wanted to get the athletes' T levels up, so they did these short interventions, and they came up with interventions that, without touching a person, just by talking to them, giving an interaction, they could reliably double the testosterone production in a very short period of time. So these models are now very dynamic. They're not the old static models. The idea isn't just you're born with it and you go with it. But even with this dynamism, this old idea about the testosterone itself having a particular kind of character, a certain set of programs of behaviors that it's going to bestow on people, is still in that model. And the notion of T creating a hostile or aggressive disposition or violent behavior is one of those important ideas. So the fact that the important studies on criminal violence and testosterone use an outdated model of physiology and behavior is only one of the reasons to suspect they shouldn't still be influential. Another is this: double-blind, placebo-controlled studies in which neither the investigator nor the participants know who's getting T versus an inert substance are the gold standard for establishing what T does. And such studies have consistently found T to have no effect on aggressive behavior or feelings. A number of such studies have involved raising T to supraphysiological levels, meaning it's well beyond the upper limit of the range that's seen in healthy men, and have also included asking not just the men in the studies, but their significant others to report on the men's mood and behavior over the time period where they're getting the hormone. No effect on aggression, anger, or hostility in real-world situations and interactions has been observed in studies that have used this design. That's huge. That's not what people typically expect. But at present, researchers still often read the overwhelmingly negative evidence on T and human aggression as, quote, weak and inconsistent instead of as negative. And they see this as an intriguing puzzle rather than an indication that they're going down a dead-end street. So why is that? What's going on here? And in the book, we look at the interplay between studies of T and aggression on the one hand and concurrent public discourse on violence as a social problem, especially the class and race politics of violence. From the beginning, the science and scientific narratives that link T to aggression have been about both individual bodies and broad social problems or trends. Why are men violently aggressive more often than women? How can the military weed out overly aggressive soldiers? How to know who is destined to be a violent recidivist versus a person who might be rehabilitated? These aren't mere matters of scientific interest. They're political, social questions. Testosterone right now has figured in discussions of one of the most explosive issues of our times, and that's the highly racialized interplay between violent crime and the use of excessive police force against unarmed civilians, especially against black men and other men and women of color. In a neatly drawn parallel, high T is seen as driving both violent crime and the rampant overuse of force in policing. And I don't have the time to take you through all the details of the various places where this narrative has shown up. We do that in the book, but what we do more is actually drill down to the studies that keep on getting these little side passing references to the studies that seem to anchor this in reality. For 2 decades, as one example, Alan Mazur, I hope I'll have time at the end to talk about him a little bit more. He's a sociologist. He's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is a prestigious group. For more than 2 decades, he has claimed that high T levels in young black men might explain broad social patterns of crime, such as the FBI statistics for the United States in 2013 that show 38% of murderers, people convicted of murder, were, quote, known to be black, and 51% of victims were black. So I want to pause and just say this is a sociologist who, instead of taking into account everything that we know, the vast vast data on the social structure of policing, of surveillance, of where are the police happening, what are the kinds of stresses that are going on in particular communities, how do police escalate very often, how do many circumstances in marginal communities escalate crime, and so on. How do we know, for example, there have always been massive disparities at every step of the criminal justice process, from the initial step of policing that often can ramp up stress and hostility in a neighborhood instead of tamping it down, depending on how that's done, to then, once there is a crime, the disparity in the likelihood that someone who's a person of color will be arrested for that crime, then the disparities in how that crime gets discharged, so that there are great racial disparities in conviction rates, and then in great racial disparities in sentencing rates. So all of that is shaping this, and that just disappears behind a theory that is about different biologies among the people who are supposedly overwhelmingly responsible for aggression and violence. I'm going to come back to it because there's a way in which Mazur and others appear to be using this reciprocal model and talk about challenges, social challenges, as being the thing that raises testosterone, that then puts into motion higher levels of violence. But what we show in the book is that it's not really using that reciprocal model, because in fact, within the way that they describe the studies and do the studies, the challenges that are generated come inherently from a presumed hostility and chaotic nature of Black communities themselves. They never so much as allude to any of the broader social processes that put people under stress, which can in fact raise testosterone. But these studies have a whole logic that is about locating the cause of violence within the bodies of men, and in specifically Black men. So I don't have a whole lot of time. I'm going to keep going and tell you about a link with social class as well. So the studies are a little bit old, but it's worth looking at them because they're the classics, they're the foundations. They're still being used, they're cited in criminology textbooks, they're cited in biology textbooks, sociology, psychology, and in the ongoing literature in behavioral biology. So one of the biggest researchers on all of this was James Dabbs. James Dabbs was a social psychologist who was one of the most engaging writers and speakers to ever turn his attention to testosterone. He was a very, very interesting guy, and so he was a passionate researcher. He sometimes loved to debunk myths about testosterone, so it's more than a little ironic that his work on testosterone among prisoners and among people of different occupations helped to solidify two really big myths, one about testosterone and criminal violence, and the other, the idea that people occupy the social class position they occupy because of testosterone. So one of his best-known studies is a 1987 study of men in a Georgia prison that supposedly showed this fact that more violent offenders had higher T levels than nonviolent offenders. It built on that study that was linked with the My Lai massacre in various ways, but it looked better, it looked bigger, it looked more rigorously done. But there were huge problems with it, including, I don't know how many of you know anything about statistics, but they did more than 51 comparisons. There were so many variables and so many comparisons, so there were 89 men in the study. They did 51 different comparisons at least, and they found 4 statistically significant associations, 3 of them applying only to subgroups in the analysis. In other words, they found barely what you might expect by complete random chance. There's no reason to think that there's anything in here that is a valid association. They also failed to control for one of the most obvious things, which is age, because they're comparing a whole group of men in prison, younger men. There's a long-standing acknowledgement that age is very associated with the type of crime, and that what they found was that the older men, everybody has seen this in their studies, older men, in fact, have less violent crimes. If you look at an overall prison population, testosterone decreases with age, especially in American populations. So what you have here is what we would call a spurious correlation. The link between crime, violent crime, and T is actually explained by the decrease in T over time and its link with age. So I could go through a lot more of those associations, but that's the main one I just wanted to point out. Dabbs also was one of the most important people to point, even against his own studies, say, well, you know, crime is a uniquely human construct, and if we want to connect this with animal research, we need to go to other things. So they came up with the idea that antisocial behavior, more generally, was the thing that was linked to testosterone. And so here, this shows you this massive study. This particular study, I believe, I'm forgetting right now, but I'm pretty sure that this is a study of military veterans. And there are, again, many, many things that you would want to control that they didn't actually control, the variables. And the idea, I'll just give you a quote, when he begins moving forward out into the world to describe the implications of this. And he putting together his findings on prisoners with research on T among people with different occupations, this idea that T causes downward social mobility. In his words, quote, "Many men with high testosterone levels are too impatient and aggressive to find their ways to positions of responsible leadership," unquote. So the studies, the details of the studies stick with people much less than a quote like that, with this idea and this notion that it's, again, it's something that lodges inside a person that actually explains the social system. Instead of taking what we can observe and know and measure about social dynamics, social structures, institutions, material differences into account, the causal model, it's not that society shapes and influences, but that individual people are like the little atoms that very predictably add up to a social structure. I just want to, it's a very broad sweep and introduction to the kinds of findings that we have in the book and why they actually matter. Okay, I'm out of time, so I don't have time to give you more details of the studies. You'll have to read the book. But I just wanted to end with this, to just know that this is a zombie fact. Placebo-controlled studies show no consistent link between T and real-world violence, aggression, or hostility. Those T studies that do show an association between T and criminal violence are badly flawed. They're fatally flawed. Claims that T is associated with lower social class do not take account of the stresses and challenging situations that cause T to rise. So you have different physical activities in different occupations, for example. There are many, many, many things. It's also, those occupation studies are wildly idiosyncratic in terms of how they classify people. Those studies are also just too messy to be trusted. And finally, studies that assert high T is behind racial patterns of crime they're grounded on and they build into their methods the idea that Black communities are chaotic, disorderly places. And they actually do not test many of the associations that they assert at the end, but they often have a narrative that seems both plausible and very contemporary because of claiming to use these reciprocal models, the so-called challenge hypothesis. So the idea that it's challenges that are experienced in so-called inner city communities by young Black men then would cause T to rise and cause them to be violent. But in fact, within these studies, the challenges are completely generated by the young men themselves to each other. Most of the variables in that whole causal chain are never actually measured, and nothing about the larger social system is taken into account. So the studies just can't be trusted to make these conclusions. And I'll just leave you with this. Let's kill the zombie. Talking about too much testosterone, talking about testosterone poisoning, even if we think we're joking, it's tongue-in-cheek. Next time somebody sort of halfway jokes and says to you, "Oh, I'm drowning in my house because there's too much testosterone." I have 6 older brothers, And 2 much older, but 4 I grew up with, and I love my brothers, but I was all too happy to believe in testosterone poisoning. It takes practice, it takes discipline, but it actually really matters. This seeps into our consciousness, and it's part of what makes us, on some level, believe and tell each other that the world is how it is because of our biologies, and that our stereotypes, our racial stereotypes, our class stereotypes, our sex stereotypes, are somehow grounded in something real and material. So let's just stop. Let's stop doing it. Let's call it out. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for those amazing presentations. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. So we have 5 minutes for questions from the audience. So if anybody has a question, can you please approach one of the microphones?
I just have a quote here and actually address just this question you're saying, the idea that nature causes this behavior and we can go, they can be changed. Then I want you to put it into perspective. The world in the past has been ruled by force, and man has dominated over women by reason of his more forceful, aggressive qualities, both of body and mind. But the scales are already shifting, force is losing its weight, and mental alertness, institution, the spiritual qualities of love and service in which woman is strong are gaining ascendancy. Hence, the new age will be an age less masculine and more permeated with the feminine ideals. Or to speak more exactly, will be an age in which the masculine and feminine elements of civilization will be more properly balanced. Just I want to maybe address this quote.
Yeah. I'd love to.
In context with what you just
said. May I ask, first of all, who wrote that or said that?
Oh, this is a Baha'i quotation. I think they might have been Abdul Baha, who is the prophet, who is the son of the prophet,
okay.
founder of the Baha'i faith.
Oh, great.
Yes.
That's a Baha'i quotation.
Exactly.
Okay. So there are 2 parts to that I would like to address. One part, and I think this is the part that I would like to hold up and assert, and that is the idea that the qualities of human beings have too often been cut into, and that only some of our human qualities are validated, and often it's not the most productive and useful qualities. So the idea that that force is and should be the characteristic that we most prize and allow to move forward, whether it's physical force or the idea of mental force, and just this notion that forcefulness and power is something to revere. But I think very often in our attempts to address gender injustice and gender inequality in the world, it's too easy to accept the idea that those qualities that have been disrespected and devalued and marginalized, like love, like insight, like human compassion, the ability to relate, to understand, etc., justice and fairness. I think at the same moment that we want absolutely to revere those qualities, I don't think it helps us to continue asserting that those are female qualities, and that we can use that metaphorically, we can use that historically, we can use that as an idea for the way in which men and women have been seen and characterized and valued. But I think that we shoot ourselves in the foot, quite literally, if we continue to say that these female qualities have to be done. We actually all have these qualities. Professor Joel's presentation this morning is, it's really interesting. We know from so many different kinds of study and analysis that these are the qualities that all human beings have. So in our desire and our eagerness to bring women on equal political and social footing with men and to change the world, I think it can be hard to let go of something that feels like this is the place where women have superiority. This is where we really shine. But I think we have to let go of that idea that these are our special qualities if we're going to really change the world.
So we have time perhaps for one last question, and then we'll have to finish.
I have more than one question. So is that bad? Okay, let me ask the first question, which I have, and that's to Cecily. In your I appreciated your presentation on African American families and the challenge of balancing work and family. That's like a really important topic. But I was wondering, because I was just wondering about how these women who were trapped in many low-wage occupations, did you explore with them the whole kind of dynamic of resistance? For example, there's been across the country McDonald's workers, many of whom are women of color, who have come out against sexual harassment and sexual violence and sexual discrimination in McDonald's. And so they've been on NBC, CNN, and so forth. So, and in fact, some of the most prominent spokeswomen have been Black women. So I was just wondering if you had explored that topic with some of the women that you interviewed. Well, not necessarily that one, but just other forms of resistance. It doesn't have to be sexual harassment.
So this was actually a secondary data analysis. So I'm analyzing data that has been collected about roughly 20 years ago or so. And I would say that the idea of resistance wasn't really explored, but also I would say that it really didn't come up as I was reading data from the families either. Because some things that weren't explicitly asked came up kind of in a topic of conversation. I think people probably had their individual ways of resisting, and some of that could be something as simple as, I'm leaving this job who's not, because I'm not being treated right here. But it didn't seem like there were these sort of collective responses or collective resistance.
Yeah, because I would like to encourage you, because I think that you have this, this desire to do this kind of work. I think, documenting and really analyzing this kind of work is just so important, because, the news stations are very variable in terms of how they are going to report the resistance of women to the oppressive mechanisms of our society. And now let me just turn really quickly to
I'm sorry, I hate to cut the discussion short. No. I'm so sorry.
But it's such
already,
a good question.
Unless there is time, is there time?
I have a good
I have
question
here
for
that
Dawn.
we have a next closing remarks at 12:45. Okay. I have to leave. I personally have to leave to teach, but if somebody can take my place, yes. Perfect.
I just have one question for Dawn.
Oh,
I have more than one. And that has to do with, in your study of middle-class women, other research on middle-class families have really pointed, especially work by Arlie Hochschild and other people, have really talked about the outsourcing of much of the household labor and much of the child care, et cetera, with respect to this is how one mechanism whereby they are able, just usually by utilizing the, especially migrant labor, et cetera, to thrive in professional occupations, or at least to survive in occupational, these situations. Did you find that in your study?
Well, I would say that certainly some mothers did use sort of nanny care. That wasn't or babysitters that would come in, and that was a version of outsourcing. Oftentimes those kinds of utilization was complicated because there's a dynamic of being a Black woman hiring a often Black person who's not a family member and often not from a sort of quote unquote American tradition, and oftentimes may have internalized some of the ideas about what it means to be a Black person in society. So people were very kind of reticent about those relationships and often tried to scrutinize the people who would be caring for their children. Yeah. A lot of mothers often, and I think this is something that sort of quantitative data has supported, that while poor and working class Black women have sort of moved away from using family members because those family members often have occupations that they can now more easily get in the workforce, and they're lucrative. Middle-class Black mothers are more likely to still use kin, and so a lot of the mothers I spoke to, at least for periods of time, would use their mothers or other kin members would even move from out of state to help during sort of more intense periods of childcare. And I should say that the age range for the kids was 10 and under. So, but some of these mothers would provide that kind of care.
That's interesting because
Yeah.
you reported that a lot of these women maintain their presence in the labor market.
Yeah.
And yet that's very difficult when you have young children.
Absolutely.
So, that's
and I think that part of that was that their orientation to maintaining presence in the workforce was that they should be doing that, and they were supported by their families, both by their, obviously spouses that were there were also supportive, but they often had communities of caregivers who were there to support them both instrumentally and psychically. I think it's important to note that part, that they were there saying, you're doing the right thing by being out in the community and utilizing your education to provide for your family. And this doesn't take away from your mother as from your identity as a mother. It's actually a part of that identity, which I think is something that challenges some of the ways people talk about motherhood among white middle-class moms in the U.S. context.
Okay,
So thank you for your question. Sorry. Hopefully I answered.
Other questions? Fascinating panel. Thank you so much for your presentations, and we really appreciate your being able to take the time to be here because I know how busy some of you have been. And before we close, I just want to thank all the speakers who agreed to come here for these 2 days and to really provide us with such important information about the whole topic of women in the world, and some thought about how we can conceive and begin to put ideas out there about a new paradigm, about how to approach a more peaceful world. And I think over the last day and a half, we've really received a lot of amazing ideas and information which will be very helpful for us to take beyond this conference and to see if we can pursue more research and to write more about this topic. I certainly hope we can get a book out of these proceedings, and I think that's a possibility. But it's mostly to the speakers that I would like to address my thanks, because I think they really brought to light the importance of this topic. So we are going to close this conference at this time and invite all of you to join us in the back of the room for lunch. And safe journey to all those who traveled here, and hope to see you at another conference on women where we've advanced a little bit further about our understanding of a new paradigm. Thank you very much.